Hello and welcome to week 3 of Simple Cooking with Heart. This week we're focusing on increasing whole grain consumption, and we're making 2 different recipes that feature whole grains. Our first recipe is couscous stuffed squash, and our second recipe is granola. Before we get started cooking our granola or the stuffing for our squash, we want to pre-cook the squash itself. Squash is a pretty dense vegetable and it takes a while to cook in the oven. So to prep our squash, we're going to cut off this little bit here at the top. It's not particularly tasty. And then we're going to cut right through the middle. So now that they're cut in half, I'm going to scoop out all of the seeds on the inside. Trying to do this the not messy way, and hopefully I don't have to go ahead and stick my hand in there, but I might. Yeah, I do. And then I will do the other side. Normally, this recipe, we use 1 squash per person, and we don't cut it in half. We just cut off the top and then scoop out all of the seeds. But since I'm using a butternut squash and not an acorn squash, we're gonna use halves. So that's what it should look like when you're done scooping out the seeds. Be a little less messy than that. But it should look something like this. We're gonna put it on a baking sheet. And then we're gonna place it in a preheated to 400-degree oven. So our squash is gonna take about 40 minutes to cook. And while it's cooking, we are gonna get started on our granola. For our granola, we need 2 cups of old-fashioned oats, a cup of dried cranberries, half a cup of slivered almonds, a 1/4 cup of flax seeds, a 1/3 of a cup of nut butter. The recipe calls for peanut butter. I'm actually using sun butter because I don't particularly care for peanut butter. 2 tablespoons of canola oil and a 1/4 cup of maple syrup. So when we're making granola, we're gonna make it very similarly to how we would bake a cake, in that we are going to mix all of the dry ingredients and then all of the wet ingredients. So we're gonna start with our oats, cranberries, our almonds, flax seeds, and then our pinch of salt. We're gonna stir that all together until it is nice and evenly combined and there's no clumps of one thing. There we go. Next, we are going to combine our wet ingredients. So we have our sun nut butter, peanut butter, canola oil, and maple syrup. And we're gonna combine those as well. Let me grab a spoon and combine those. Until they're nice and smooth. The fantastic thing about granola is that you can modify it any way that you like. If you like a cinnamon granola, you can add a little bit of cinnamon, a little bit of allspice or cloves. If you like raisins instead of cranberries, you can use those. Whatever your family likes, you should absolutely try with this granola. So we're just drizzling this mixture over our dry mixture. Making sure to grab all of it that we can. And then we're stirring to combine. And we did it this way so that you don't have, clumps of peanut butter or like a really oily spot in your granola. want to make sure it's all the way combined so that when we compact it in our baking dish, it stays compact. So when we cut it, it'll be bars and not just granola, which is delicious, but granola bars are a lot easier to eat on the go. Making sure to get in all of the corners, get all of those little flax seeds completely coated. Ooh, making a little bit of a mess. And if for whatever reason at the end you don't end up with granola bars, but just plain granola, that's absolutely okay too. All right, it looks like we're almost there. Looks mixed. Now we're going to press it into our baking sheet that's lined with parchment paper. I'm just trying to get it into the corners and in one even sheet. So that when it bakes, I don't have one corner that's burnt while the rest of it's still very, very soft. I want to press it down pretty firmly. Nice and compact. All right, when you're done, it should look something like this. And then we're gonna slide it into the oven. So our granola bars and our squash are now in the oven. So we're going to go ahead and prep our filling for our squash. We are using couscous today as our whole grain. The fantastic thing about couscous is it's very easy to cook, as you'll see in a moment. But you could substitute any whole grain in for this couscous. You could use brown rice, you could use quinoa, you could use wild rice, you can use all different kinds of grains. You just want to make sure that you read the back of the package because every grain cooks a little bit differently. For couscous, for example, it's a little different than rice. For rice, you might use a 2-to-1 water to rice ratio, but for couscous, you use 1 cup of the couscous for 1 cup of rice. Couscous is very simple to cook. I'm simply going to measure out a cup of couscous. And then I'm going to measure out a cup of boiling water. Grab a spoon real quick, or a fork. Add it to the couscous, give it a good stir, and then cover it. And the couscous will be cooked in 4 to 5 minutes. You have to keep an eye on it so that the cover does not come off. All right, now that the couscous is cooking, we're gonna get our vegetables prepped. So starting with the onion, we're going to dice our half of an onion into very small dices. I'm gonna cut off the end, peel off the papery skin, and then we're going to dice it just like we did in our first video. So I'm gonna take my knife and cut horizontally in to just before the root. Come up a little bit higher, do it again, and again, Then I'm going to cut right into the middle. Next to that one. Next to that one. All the way to the end of the onion. Lost a piece there. All right. And then just cut going backwards. This one up a little bit smaller. Alright, I'm going to place that one in a container and then I'll get started on the rest of my produce. So off camera, I noticed that our onions were a little bit large, so I diced them up a little bit smaller. And next we're going to be cutting our celery. So I'm going to cut just the very tip that's a little bit weird off. Same with the bottom. And then so it's a little bit easier for me to work with, I'm going to cut it in half. Then I'm going to go one section at a time, cutting it into thirds. Making sure to keep my fingers far away from the knife's edge. And then cutting in the opposite direction. And then I'm going to do the same with each piece. This one I cut into 4 because it's a little bit bigger. The goal is to try to get your pieces to as close to the same size as possible. And then our last one. Once again, I'm cutting this one into 4 pieces. Once all of your celery is cut, we're going to move on to our sage. For sage, I like to cut it all at once. I'm going to cut off this little end piece here. And then slice it nice and thin. Separate it off to the side. The last thing that we have to cut is our pecans. Originally the recipe I believe calls for walnuts. I'm using pecans because that's what I have on hand right now. Any nut will do. This is mostly for texture. Giving it a nice rough chop. Put that off to the side as well. Now that we have chopped all of the things that need chopping, our couscous should be about done. I'm gonna give it a nice fluff with my fork so it's not all stuck together. Couscous, although it looks like just the grain within itself, it is a tiny pasta made with whole wheat durum semolina flour. And the cool thing about couscous that you would find in the grocery store is that actually all the couscous that we have is pre-cooked, and that's why we're able to just add boiling water and then it's ready to go. Look how beautiful that is. Nice and beautiful and fluffy. So next we're going to move over to our stove. We're going to get all of our vegetables nice and sauteed and make the rest of our stuffing. So off camera, I noticed that our onions were a little bit large, so I diced them up a little bit smaller. And next we're going to be cutting our celery. So I'm going to cut just the very tip that's a little bit weird off. Same with the bottom. And then so it's a little bit easier for me to work with, I'm going to cut it in half. Then we're going to go one section at a time, cutting it into thirds. Making sure to keep my fingers far away from the knife's edge. And then cutting in the opposite direction. Then I'm going to do the same with each piece. This one I cut into forks, so it's a little bit bigger. The goal is to try to get your pieces to as close to the same size as possible. And then our last one. Once again, I'm cutting this one into 4 pieces. Once all of your celery is cut, we're going to move on to our sage. For sage, I like to cut it all at once. I'm going to cut off this little end piece here. And then slice it nice and thin. Separate it off to the side. The last thing that we have to cut is our pecans. Originally the recipe I believe calls for walnuts. I'm using pecans because that's what I have on hand right now. Any nut will do. This is mostly for texture. Giving it a nice rough chop. side as well. All right, now that we have chopped all of the things that need chopping, our couscous should be about done. I'm gonna give it a nice fluff with my fork so it's not all stuck together. Couscous, although it looks like just the grain within itself, it is a tiny pasta made with whole wheat durum semolina flour. And the cool thing about couscous that you would find in the grocery store is that actually all the couscous that we have is pre-cooked, and that's why we're able to just add boiling water and then it's ready to go. Look how beautiful that is. Nice and beautiful and fluffy. So next we're gonna move over to our stove. We're going to get all of our vegetables nice and sauteed and make the rest of our stuffing. So next we are going to saute our aromatics in our pan. So we're adding about 1.5 tablespoons of our canola oil to the pan, getting that nice and hot. Then adding our onion, our celery, our sage, salt, and pepper. I'm gonna cook that down for 7 to 8 minutes on medium low. We've been cooking now for about 8 to 10 minutes. We're going to add our thawed frozen spinach. I'm gonna cook that till it's fully thawed and heated in our onion mixture. Just a minute or so and it should be ready to go. Now I'm just mixing to make sure that all of the onions are fully combined with all of the spinach. All right, I'm going to turn my stove off and add a little less than half of my couscous. I should add about half. Woo. And stir. I'm going to move this to a bowl, and then I'm going to add my maple syrup and my crushed pecans. When I moved our filling over, I noticed that our butternut squash is all the way done. So I pulled it out of the oven and it's cooling now so that it'll be cool enough for us to stuff it. So I have our stuffing mixture here with the couscous. I'm going to add our pecans, our maple syrup, and the last bit of the canola oil. Now, the maple syrup might seem a little bit weird in this recipe, but you have to remember that squashes oftentimes have a very good deal of natural sweetness, and that bit of maple syrup really helps to bring that out. And I'm just stirring to make sure that all of it is combined with all of the couscous and all of the spinach and the aromatics as well. Awesome. Now I'm going to set that to the side. Set these to the side. Our squash is still a little bit hot, so I'm going to leave that for a moment. I was also able to pull out our granola bars, so I'm going to take those and pull them over here. They did get a little bit extra brown, but that's okay. They're nice and cool now. I'm going to pull them out. And then I'm going to slice them. I'm going to do my slices into fairly large chunks. Hopefully, I packed it down enough so that it doesn't completely break apart. We'll see though. Whoop. It's a little crumbly, but we still have some recognizable bars here too. And then I'm gonna let this cool down all the way on a separate pan. 5 minutes later, and our stuffed squash is completely done. Our cheese is nice and crispy on top, and we're ready to eat. And here is what our granola looks like now that it's cut up and cooled. I hope that you enjoy these recipes as well, and I hope you get a chance to play around with different whole grains. Thanks for watching.